And welcome everyone. So as Audrey mentioned, we're going to be talking about estimation. And I say from every angle, I'll note that the idea of this presentation really is to give you a deeper understanding of why we're doing estimation with a number of different ways to think about perhaps constructing your own method of approaching it, depending on what exactly you're trying to solve for. So I'll offer up a few specific techniques and perhaps some recommended ones that'll work in many circumstances. But note, really what I hope you'll walk away with is a deeper understanding of the mechanisms behind estimation and maybe what works well and not in various circumstances. So with that, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Arlen, one of the co-founders of Lightspeed. I've been helping to run this company for about 14 years now, been in the Agile industry for about 20. I had a background in something very much again in the product owner space, more or less, customer facing work. And since then, I've done work in really all over the place, coaching and training every class under the sun, and writing a book about HR and doing lean stuff and so on. So a lot of experience, real world, working with clients, large and small, really around the world. And a lot of what I'm bringing to this presentation comes from those experiences. I also say I've borrowed from masters in the field, some of the folks that we've worked with. I'll call out one particular, George Dinwiddie, a longtime colleague of ours and friend of Lightspeed. Wrote an excellent book on this subject called Software Estimation Without Guessing. So pull out one or two little tchotchkes from that for those of you who might go a little bit deeper than we get in the presentation. So with that, let's get into it. There are going to be a few key sections in this presentation. First of all, we're going to start talking about the various situations and scenarios where you might choose to estimate or not. And in all likelihood, most of you will be applying multiple different approaches for estimation for several of these at least, if not all of them, at various points in time. Once we understand what we're trying to achieve with the estimates, we'll be talking about some of the methods that are out there, some of those popular ones, some that are maybe a touch further afield, and then we'll walk into some specific techniques. So estimation in action is really, I'd say, a lot of the core of this presentation, looking at a few specific ways to go about doing it and putting the pieces together into a holistic system, and we'll talk about which of those again work well or not. Finally, a few tips just for trying to set up a situation in your organizations where estimates will be better in general and your forecast will be better. A lot of this is less about the direct techniques of estimation and more about a lot of other factors in play that affect how good it ends up being. So and again, as Audrey mentioned, please feel free to ask questions anytime. I'll be trying to keep a live eye on the question log here as we go along. And at worst, we'll gather up some at the end and begin to address them then. So to begin with, let's talk about what are some of the reasons why we might choose to estimate. One of the first and foremost, and I'd say these are almost in the order they would naturally happen, as a matter of fact. One of the first questions you might ask is, where should we invest our money organizationally? That is, in which projects or large-scale endeavors? So in other words, it's in large part, it's a cost-benefit analysis question at a very high level. We're considering a dozen some odd projects. How do we determine whether we choose this one over that one? Well, for instance, at this level, we're probably not getting into very detailed estimates. They're unnecessary. We could go with something very high level, maybe t-shirt sizes, small, medium, large, and so on. A very high level idea of the value proposition, and that might be enough for that sort of thing. In a very much related aspect of that, the idea of funding projects. How much money do we need to allocate to a given project to get it where it needs to go? Many of our clients have been moving away from projects even as a construct, so this might be a little bit different. We might have already funded certain groups, and then we're really asking, how do we allocate those monies that have already been applied to these teams, to these departments, toward the most useful and valuable information? But getting a sense there of, is this a 6-month project, is it a 12-month project, and similarly, probably a high-level thing. Now, both of those things I would imagine are relatively unusual for many of you attending this webinar. These high-level portfolio management things, you're probably, many of you, working directly in projects that are already underway and funded. So I'd say the rest of these are probably the most commonplace situations you'll run into. Looking into the future is a big reason we estimate. In Agile methods, when you talk about things like velocity, at a local level, it's about getting a sense of a team's capacity for, say, a sprint or an iteration. But in the long term, we can use those metrics for gathering about such things, about our team's historical capacity, to make projections, to make guesses about scenarios in the future. And I think that if you look at this one and the next one are not at all unrelated. We can also go backwards about it. We can say, how much time do we want to allocate towards something, and simply allocate that time and move forward. As it so happens, I ran across a very interesting article about the development approach at Basecamp, a longtime maker of some relatively inexpensive project management software that actually we used in the early days of Lightspeed, as it so happens. A little alternative to Scrum that they practice internally. So I'll keep that for a little bit later. And then getting into these final scenarios, making sure stories are small enough so they flow through the process properly, so they're easy to plan and test and adapt if necessary, and all of that. Trying to disaggregate them so we can keep value in more atomic units and roll it out without having to wait for a lot of it to accrue. And then finally, capacity planning. Well, most of the methods you're probably aware of really were meant for this purpose, to keep a team from under or over committing, usually in the sort of boundaries of something like a sprint or iteration. And finally, if we're looking at a given, let's say, story, a user story, a feature, a function we'd like to build, there is determining what is the right approach for this given story. If we understand how much value we want to get out of it and how high the quality bar needs to be, what of these three possible development approaches would be the one that would be most worthwhile and sensible. So all of these are different reasons, and well, there are different methods that you would use for each of them, to put it simply. Now, one big picture point here is that we shouldn't estimate just to estimate, and we really need to understand that fundamentally we want to do just enough of it to achieve the objective that we're trying to achieve, and that very often teams and companies get themselves into a lot of trouble by putting a lot more impetus and a lot more importance on this idea of estimation and on, let's say, making actuals meet estimates and other such things, which are maybe a bit of a vestige of the past. Maybe those sorts of things were very critical in a once and done delivery method like waterfall, where truly the estimates and the forecast were almost all that customers had to rely upon to see if the project was going to to come in properly or not, and to therefore begin to course correct. In Agile methods, we have much more local information, one would hope, a lot more transparency, a lot more opportunity for changing and adapting, which means that, putting it simply, estimates really shouldn't matter as much as they did before. And that therefore, we want to spend just enough time to get to a useful answer while being very careful not to get more detailed than the information we have allows us to safely get. And this is a very common problem. So remember this, right? There's a point where you've talked about all you have to talk about in an organization, and trying to get more fine-grained than the numbers you're coming up with is a fool's errand. It is going to actually mislead you actively. So let's get into some of the details here. If we're thinking about a lot of the, let's say, the elements of an estimation system, that's what we're going to begin with here. I think these are some of the core elements that I would consider. They're the units. And I mean, are we talking about hours or days, or is it story points, or is it t-shirt sizes? These sorts of things. What are the appropriate units for a given problem we're trying to solve again? There is the approach. And by this, I mean things like planning poker, like the white elephant sizing, affinity clustering, things like this. These are all methods of getting people together and actually having them arrive at an answer. And of course, that is really orthogonal to what units you use. And finally, the time horizon. Right here, what we're really saying is, should we estimate, if you will, more frequently and in more detail, or maybe a little bit longer term and a little bit less detail? And giving you part of the answer there, I think in general, we'd rather not try to estimate way into the future, simply because our information tends to be worse way into the future, and we end up with not so good data. But sometimes we do have to look into the future, and there are approaches that'll work, if you will, better or worse for that purpose. So this is a key aspect to consider. When designing measurement systems, and this was something I ran into quite a lot in my Six Sigma tutelage, the notion of balancing accuracy and precision, rather. So accuracy is to say that, if I were to note that it's going to take me an hour to get to my office from here, if I were to drive there, and I got there in, well, precisely 60 minutes, that would be very accurate. If I got there in 55 minutes, maybe a little less accurate. Whereas precision would be how finely I'm slicing that number. So if I were to say, I think I can get into the office in 60 minutes, This is a bit different from me saying, I think I get into the office in about an hour. Because about an hour, I've got a little wiggle room there. And why might the latter answer be better than the former? Because it's more accurate, actually. By being less precise, we can actually be more accurate in some cases, because we don't end up getting into detail that our information doesn't allow. So to put this very simply, you would never like a system to be more precise, that is getting down to seconds when really the appropriate unit should be days, right? It should never be more precise than it is accurate. And this is really something to keep in mind, because definitely, for instance, any beginning Agile team, their data is going to be terrible, right? And especially if you're in an organization, as many organizations are currently operating, where you're moving people around a lot, right? Where teams don't tend to be stable over the long term, this is really going to be an issue. Your data is going to consistently suck, and then we're really going to have a problem getting to it. So I'll come to some of the answers for how to improve this systematically later, but keep that in mind. We really have to make sure that the data we have coming in is something that we can look at and say, yeah, that's sensible, right? It's not oscillating so wildly as to be, to be useless. Confidence. In some cases, it doesn't really matter if our estimates meet our actuals. Okay, things can take as long as they need to take to get to the right quality level. In other cases, we are driven by things like external commitments. We have some sort of regulatory event happening. We have some sort of a conference or something that is controlled externally, and therefore we need to meet a certain date by a certain point in time. We're under contract to do it. And of course, when those external kind of conditions are imposed, often we need a bit more confidence we might be able to get away with otherwise. And finally, directionality. This is of all these, this is probably the simplest. In general, you would of course probably rather underestimate a bit rather than overestimate. That is, we'd rather, well, I'll say, undercommit and overdeliver, right? And in general, therefore, if we estimate something and it's smaller than we thought it was, rarely is that going to be a big problem. Though sometimes, right? Sometimes we can end up spending time we shouldn't spend on something when we should be moving on, just because we're looking there. So directionality is just a matter of, which one is going to be safer, to err on sort of a low estimate or a high one. So one other little aspect are the units. Here, almost certainly the one you've heard about the most often is story points. Very, very popular in the Agile community for a long time. They were really there at the genesis of extreme programming, very popular. So we'll talk about story points in a moment. But note, there are other ones out there. Function points are maybe one of the older school ones, if you will. And these were really developed by Capers-Jones and one of the early estimation gurus. Things like function points are very detailed estimation techniques that rely on tons and tons of information about the system that you're developing. So I'll say that one, I've not classically seen it used a lot in Agile environments, but it is nonetheless still out there and fairly significant over the course of the really the industry. I'd say you'll see it out there. There are story points, very popular. There's story count. There's something called the no estimates movement, which has been around for a while now. And story count is just what it sounds like. Instead of saying that a team would do a certain number of story points, say in a sprint, you would just say they do a certain number of stories, often offering up a slight range to account for the variability that you normally see there. Then you got ideas like ideal developer days. This is just the notion that in a given day, you don't have probably 8 hours of productive time as such, but probably more like 5 or 6 or something like that, once you remove lunch and context switching and everything else that happens, meetings and so on. So ideal developer days are just a way to say, is the work doable in a day or not? And that's kind of it's a bit of a balance between the abstraction of story points and the more calendar linkage of something like hours or days. Hours you traditionally saw used pretty often actually in the early days of methods like Scrum. Typically, these were used at a very detailed level to look at tasks, right? So you'd have a given backlog item or a user story. Your team would break it into tasks, and they'd estimate those tasks. This was really a way to keep track of the work that they were doing over the course of a sprint and know whether they were likely to achieve it or not, and therefore course correct day by day over the sprint. And I'd say some teams still do this. It's not an unusual thing for early teams. I'd say it's less common now than it used to be, because a lot of teams find that it's not necessary, right, to achieve the objective of will we make it by the end of the sprint. If you're actually getting things done on a regular basis, often you can just look and say, we're going to make it or not based on how many stories you finished, for instance. Nonetheless, out there, not necessarily a bad thing, and it can be useful for teams getting a sense of the more detailed capacity. Then there are actually the series, right? So if we're using story points, let's say, quite often you would see them used with the Fibonacci series, which is a numerical series where any two items add up to equal the next item in the set, or doubles, which are very similar. You'll notice something about both of these sets, that they're fairly close in the lower end of the sets, that 1, 2, 3, you're right there with the Fibonacci series. But as you get beyond that, the gaps between each element get bigger and bigger. And this is simply out there. The reason this is done is because big items are less certain than smaller items. So they're really trying to capture that idea and to be able to say, we don't want to try to be really precise when we're talking about something. Is it a 21 or a 22? Right? In all likelihood, your information is not good enough to slice it that fine. So that's the idea of series like that. You'll often see teams getting to very, very simple methods over time, where they're just saying either stories are in the right general size range or they're not. And in fact, a lot of the teams I've worked with have fundamentally done things this way, that you get things down to a few days or so, and then you say that's fine, and you move along with it and just get the stories done. So certainly that's something. It sounds maybe not as disciplined, but actually you'll find with very mature teams, it can be a better way to go, because we don't want to waste time estimating if it's not buying us anything, right? It has to be useful. So it all comes back to those questions you're trying to answer. And if it's just about not overcommitting in the sprint and meeting the right quality bar, then that may be an approach that works quite well if you've got a team that's been together for a good long time. Now let's start with story points just for a moment. A few comments here. The idea of a story point was that you could take all of the factors that could influence how long something might actually take and just kind of abstract them out. Just say, if you're having a bunch of people chat about how long something is going to take, there's probably a lot of different information that's coming to bear, right? How busy are these people? How experienced are these people? How much do they know this particular system? How available are they? Are they split across multiple teams? And you could create a huge complicated spreadsheet with all those factors and go about it that way, trying to put in precise numbers for each element and then having this fancy equation to generate the perfect estimate. But this would be foolish. And why? Because even if you do have some of that information in certain cases, you almost certainly won't have it in all cases. And then you end up in a weird situation where your information's very detailed and great in some cases and just terrible in others. And so your equation just won't work consistently. And I think we would rather this be a little bit more consistent sort of process. So as story point says, as long as we got the right people at the table and they can be thinking about all of these factors, whatever they are that make sense in this circumstance, then we're hoping they can translate all of that, frankly, somewhat subjective knowledge into this single number. And we can just have people talk about why the number might be bigger for some folks than others and share that information, those different perspectives, which is maybe even more the point than the number itself, the sharing of the information to get a more comprehensive understanding of the, of the scenario, of the situation. So all of these things, right? Volume, maybe something you have to do 1,000 of them. Well, that would be volume, right? Complexity, it's intellectually difficult. It's complex. It's a hard problem to solve. Things like knowledge, of course. Are we familiar with this area or is it new to us? Something is new, quite often your information may be just inherently very weak because you've not experienced it before. And finally, the things like uncertainty, right? There may be aspects of it you don't know, so we may have ways to get in there and begin to explore those a little bit more thoroughly. So I think the idea of a story point was always that this number being useful, it relies on the right people being at the table and speaking about all of these elements that otherwise you might have put into your fancy equation in more of an open fashion and just pulling their heads together and saying, yeah, this feels about right. Now, one other really important thing about a story point is it, as actually a number of the other methods do, it relies on relativity. And what I mean is, at the end of the day, as we come up with many items and we're comparing them in Agile methods, it's about essentially grouping them into light categories of some sort. Here are a bunch of things that are all of similar size. Let's call them all one story point. Here are a bunch of things which are a little bigger. Let's call them 2 story points. Does it mean we think they're all the same? Of course it doesn't. It just means that we think these things are a little closer to this number than to that number. So especially as you're getting up into higher levels of these sets, like say the 8 on the Fibonacci series. If I'm calling something an 8-point story, really I'm saying it's somewhere between a 5-point story and a 13-point story in the Fibonacci series, but I just think it's maybe nearer to the center of that distribution than the edges. So in other words, we're trying to keep ourselves from having to be super precise here by very purposefully introducing some variability, introducing some ranges here, again, to account for the gaps in our knowledge. So that's the idea of a story point, is to really begin to do a bunch of work, and over time, as we do more work, again, assuming stability in the rest of the system with the same team, for the same, let's say, customers and technology systems to the degree, all that is similar, it will make things more consistent here. We'll get a better and better idea of what these like ranges are, right? We'll have a bunch of previous stories we did, which we call 3 points, and then when a new one comes up, we can just say, yeah, it's kind of like those, or it's kind of like these ones that are bigger or smaller. So it's a game that gets easier as you go along if you keep things consistent. Now, you're combining this idea with velocity, and again, this may be a little bit, a little bit introductory for some of you, but don't worry, I'm getting the interesting stuff soon here. Velocity is an idea of the team's capacity. It's a number which is meant to capture how much work have they historically done within a given boundary, like a sprint traditionally being the most common one. So usually what we're doing here by default is applying an approach called yesterday's weather. And this is an old one from XP, where if we don't have a team that's been running for a long time, and therefore we don't have a bunch of historical data, we would just use whatever the most recent information is. That is last sprint. Let's call that yesterday. Last sprint, if we got 20 story points done, then this sprint, well, we're going to go for about 20, assuming nothing is obviously different this time around. And if we keep doing that, that is correcting what we're targeting based on what we've just recently achieved, then we'll tend to improve our ability to commit, right, over time. And that's always been the idea of story points of velocity. No matter how you go about it, they probably start pretty weak, but over time, if you keep things stable, they'll get better and better and better. And then you can, over time, move away from just, oh, let's target what we did last sprint and look at more, little ranges and trends. If we look across the last 6 or 7 sprints, here is the range we've fallen into, and then we can have maybe a little bit better information to use. So what is the purpose of velocity? Initially, it really was just meant to say, here's what we can do in the sprint. But of course, as we begin to gather those numbers over time, it also helps us to do some good forecasting, perhaps. And I'll get to that in just a bit. All right. So briefly, we're going to do a little aside here. I've got a little presentation. I need to roll over here. I seem to jump off in another area. We'll bring it up in about 2 seconds. So I've got a little quiz here, and those of you familiar with Mentimeter, if you have been to our classes, just jump on here for a moment and fill some of this out. Very brief thing, but just to get a sense of your current situations. And as you come in here, I'll describe what each of these things means essentially. So if you say the cost of estimates not closely matching actuals is extremely high, what we're saying here is maybe you're in a situation where you're submitting big RFPs for large projects, and you're competing against other vendors, and you really get just one chance to put out your proposal, as does everyone else. So if our estimates aren't on point and the customer is scared by them or thinks that our estimates are too high compared to the competitors, that could be a real problem, right? Or maybe we're contractually obligated to meet a certain delivery amount, right? A certain amount of stuff, like story points. Not a good idea, by the way, but maybe you have contracts that are linked to that. And so therefore, if you don't meet that contract, you're going to get in a lot of trouble. That would be something you consider as a bit of a problem. The notion of this, we commonly have strong delivery data. And by the way, those of you who are on, if you just go to this website, menti.com, enter that number up there, you'll be able to, to rate these based on what you're seeing. We commonly have strong delivery data from numerous similar projects to reference. This is again saying when we do projects that they're not always, completely unique, and we have something from the past we can reference to say, here's something somewhat similar. I see some information coming in. Thank you so much. Our team has deep data about their historical delivery capacity. Again, if we keep teams together over the long term, where we move from a project to a product construct, and we have relatively stable teams for 6, 7, 9 months, a couple of years, well, then this information may be great. If we're switching teams from one project to the next and switching the composition of those teams, worse yet, all the time, again, our information is going to be terrible most of the time. And finally, estimates need to be done for entire projects at once rather than in rolling waves. What this is saying is that, you know, in many Agile projects, we're at least breaking them into big releases. And these releases might be, you know, every couple of months or every quarter. They might be much faster in some cases. But you will see organizations that still do projects and then have sprints within projects. And the estimates are linked to the whole project as one big unit, rather than really being the dates being mostly tied to the releases, which are a subset of those projects. So that's the idea here. And I'll move along in just a moment, but thank you, those of you who put it in. We can see the cost of estimates on matching actuals is pretty high, seems to be a big issue for many of you. So I'd say here, that might mean we need a little bit more advanced or a little bit more detailed estimation approaches, again, assuming our information and our data can get us there safely. It looks like the last one, this is actually a good thing that this is low, by the way. It's a bit reverse how you might normally see it. But you want this to be low like this, so that's good, right? We'd rather look in releases and estimate things for relatively short periods rather than doing it as monoliths. Strong delivery data and deep data, these are of course related. It's about having a similar team and it's about having a similar project that we're doing with that team. I think in many cases, if you're moving to an area where a team is allocated a certain consistent value streams, within which there are a few applications and a few big customer groups, and they stay there, both of these things will tend to improve, okay? So one other quick thing here, more of a little quiz, if you will, just 2 questions, very brief here. This is just to get a sense of how informed you are about, you know, some relatively basic Agile ideas. So what is a Monte Carlo simulation? That's the question, right? See how much you know about it. And I'm pretty much assuming you did pretty well here. Yes, right. So the idea of a Monte Carlo simulation, it's what's called a stochastic estimation method, where you're really looking at a range of possibilities, and you're introducing some simulations which run a number of times to basically if you will, forecast where we might be in the future based on the most pessimistic scenarios and the most optimistic ones, and a number of ones in between. So it's a way to give us kind of a fuzzy range of results here that's probably a little bit more accurate than when you try to be very precise. And I've actually got a little extra thing to show you for that later. One more simple question. It's another relative softball, I'm hoping. I see a question from Brian in there, so I will briefly answer this as soon as our quiz completes. Right, you are. Yeah, story points have been given quite a lot of clout in the Agile community. That is, most teams think that this is the way you got to do it. No, right? There are a lot of other ways you can do it as well. They have nothing officially to do with Scrum at all, actually. They were linked to XP more directly, Extreme Programming. Though definitely, I'd say they're the most popular method you'll see in practice in Scrum, unquestionably, much more popular than any other thing that we've seen across our clientele. The recommended estimation unit in the Agile Manifesto, the manifesto says nothing about estimation, really. Promoted as the best estimation unit by their creator. Interestingly, you might have noticed in one of the previous slides, but Ron Jeffries really broadly credited, at least, with the creation of story points, and has sometimes spoken against them. He said, you know, people have taken these and abused them a bit, misused them in ways that are really just bad and lead teams to poor places and create a bad culture in organizations. So he is actually promoting some other methods out there. And I will use this as an opportunity to answer Brian's question. Brian noted, he said his team recently switched from points to Fibonacci hours, right? And but they've been considering story count and no estimates as a possibility. And he asked if I recommend exploring these practices. I do. I think they're very simple ideas. You know, you'll find a lot of acrimony about this maybe out in the community and discussions of this estimation method is much better than those others, and these others are complete nonsense. I'm not such a black and white person in general. I think all of these things are in fact fuzzy gray questions that depend quite a lot on the specifics of your scenario. So I think that things like the no estimates movement fundamentally are suggesting that we look at, in a relatively simple way, are stories small enough, right? That is, are they falling into the order of a few days or so, whatever seems appropriate for the duration of your sprint length, and that's probably about right, 1 to 3 days or 4 days, something like that, on average. Make them small enough. And this is less about estimates meeting actuals, by the way, than it is about making it more appropriate for developing and adapting. So we're trying to break things into not the smallest possible units, but rather the smallest units where value is independent and where we can take something, build it, test it, and then if we decide it's not quite perfect, change it relatively easily. If things are bigger, they're harder and more expensive to change. So it's really for a lot of reasons that don't have a lot to do with meeting the number we put down to say it's going to take 3 days. And it was exactly 3 days. Yay. What does this gain us? Right? If we're done by the end of the sprint with what we said we'd be done with, then we're meeting the expectations of stakeholders. We're not misleading anyone, and we can use that to forecast. So yes, things like story count. Our team does between 15 and 17 stories per sprint. That's all it is. Okay, and again, those stories are almost certainly the same general size ranges as they would have been if you would use story points or ideal developer days or whatever, or hours, or whatever else you're using. I would say I would not advise using hours for stories. If you're using hours, usually they would be more for the subsets of stories, that is tasks, independent tasks. And that's more of a way for maybe individuals in a team to keep account of their own capacity if they have very specialized roles, right? If I'm the tester in a team and I'm the only tester, I might want to make sure that, if nobody else is going to be able to help me with testing yet because we're a new team and they haven't done the cross-functional thing so well yet and so on, then I might really be looking out for my own capacity on behalf of the remainder of the team to say, I don't want to, say I'm good to go with these 15 super testing heavy stories if in fact I'm going to be a bottleneck and fail the whole team because all that is going to crop up, in my desk there. So if you're going to use hours, keep them to tasks. If you're going to do stories, you can use story points if you want. Story count has the advantage, basically, I'd say, of being easier for people to understand. And by people, I mean people outside the team, really, your stakeholders. Because if they're taking something like story points and using those numbers to make big decisions and they don't understand what they are, then you got a problem, right? And this becomes a bigger problem as you begin to look across multiple teams and people begin to use methods like this as a way to essentially compare teams to one another. There are a lot of reasons you might want to do that, but probably looking at their capacity as such is not the best question to ask in the first place. So, and I see a question from Craig. I will come to that in just a little bit here. So hopefully, Brian, I gave you some good information. But yes, if you look up hashtag no estimates, again, it's a bit black and white in the discussions, but I think you'll get the right information from those sessions nonetheless about what the general idea is. So to get to just some specific suggestions here, and not unrelated to what I was just saying, if we're considering things like portfolio and budget planning, big picture things like that, then I would recommend straight up real high level estimation units like t-shirt sizes, small, medium, large, extra large, or perhaps the most classical ones here. And why? Because we don't probably have a great deal of detailed information up then, and it doesn't really matter quite often. If we're going to have a project and we say this project's going to make us $50 million and it's going to cost us, $1 million to build, you're looking at a 50-to-1 ratio. What if it costs us $1.4 million to build? It probably doesn't change the answer, right? It probably still is something we'd want to invest in. It's about how that one compares to other projects. So here, even if you have very fine-grained information for one or two projects, probably that isn't consistent across the board, which means if we're comparing them, we'd rather bring them to the lowest common denominator. We'd rather bring them to a place where we can safely compare them, not have super detailed information here and real fuzzy high-level information there. Later on in the deck, I mentioned some cognitive biases. I'll just call out one now. Numeracy is one you run into, where people think if your information is very finely sliced, that it's better, right? If I'm talking this project is 5,612.5 hours, then I've done a better job at coming up with this number than someone that says, I think it's 5,000 or 6,000 hours, right? Or whatever other unit they might use. When in fact, I may be totally lying to you. that the fact that I've given you a very fine-grained number does not by any means mean that that number is accurate or correct. So watch out for that idea, right? If we don't have good information, go for more abstraction. Same deal in release planning. You can use t-shirt sizes here. I'll show you a simple mechanism to do it, or you could use something like story points if you prefer. Once you get into sprint planning, definitely I'd probably go with one of these two methods. Story points, count, maybe something like ideal developer days, which can be combined with story points. But probably one of those units is the best. And finally, if you're looking at the daily scrum and planning out today and trying to decide how much we can get done, then either I would do it by gut feel, which may sound like not a good thing, but actually I think that's great. If you got a team that's reasonably confident, that can work just fine. Or you can use hours with the understanding that even though estimating in hours, you can easily get it significantly wrong. And I speak from experience, right? As a designer, I'd often be doing things like, I'm going to come with this screen design for this, entry page of this portal or something. And I would say it'll take me 4 hours and it would take me 6 hours, right? And that's way off percentage-wise, but you can imagine it's really not that unusual day by day. And if you take those sorts of differences and you apply it across 100 tasks across a team, you can really mislead yourself. And then you're back to the question of, why did we do that, right? Why are we applying all this effort to track them in the first place if they're not helping us make better plans and hit our objectives? So looking into here, and I see Craig's question. I'll get to that in just a moment, Craig. One thing I'd say is I noted if your estimates are going to be good or bad, it has a lot to do with the people at the table. So methods like the so-called three amigos or Atlassian, the folks who make Jira, they call it the triad, but it's the same idea. Having someone representing the customer product perspective, what makes this valuable? Someone representing how are we going to test it? Someone representing how are we going to build it? How are we going to document it? Any of these things that we need to do, we'd like folks at the table when we're estimating who can represent those perspectives. It could be the whole team. In many cases in the Agile methods, it is by default, but it can sometimes be similar to have a consistent little leader crew, which is, in general, it's either a subset of the team or there's some slightly higher level stakeholders maybe that are working with the team to get together and do this on a regular basis. So again, it's about not having just part of the equation. If you just have this, what's going to take to develop it, but we're not talking about what's going to take to test it or document it or roll it out, then we're missing something, right? And that's the key here is ask yourself, you can even reverse engineer this. Just go and run a few sprints and say, where were we off and why? And it's something like a retrospective. And you'll often land to, because Franklin wasn't at the table and he had the information about what the testing would have taken. Let's invite him next time. Right? So getting the right people to actually do the estimates is a big part of making it work. If we're just getting started, again, I'd say the same thing. Get started, try something in an initial sprint, and understand you're going to be wrong. We're just using ideas like yesterday's weather here to begin to get a sense of how wrong we might be and correct it over time. So we might say by default that, for each person, fundamentally, we're giving them 4 days out of the week is more or less the idea. When we're saying 8 points, we're thinking those points are something akin to an actual ideal day. And again, that's just a starting point. It's just a way for us to throw some numbers out there, get the sprint done, and look back and said, we thought we'd do 30, but we did 20. Next time, let's go for 20. And if we keep doing that, we'll get better over time. Now, a few quick notes on these estimation methods. The most popular one, planning poker. Simple idea. You got the people at the table estimating, like the three amigos, let's say. And we've got some things we'd like them to build. So we explain, here's a story. And they ask whatever questions they might have. And then they privately vote on how big or small they think it is, using, again, whatever units they're using, Fibonacci, hours, whatever. And it's really the key here is the privacy at the beginning. Because if they speak openly about it, they'll influence one another. But by keeping their guesses secret and then sharing them all at once, you'll get more of an honest answer. So a great approach for really making people feel safe and getting the best out of a group of experts without having them unduly influence one another. Great approach, but it can be a little slow if you have tons of units to do. So there, methods like this come into play a little bit. White elephant sizing, you're just saying, instead of everyone speaking about every story, one person in the team at a time goes and they say, oh, I hear you explain this story. I think it's a 3, right? They put it there. And then goes the next person who says, oh, this next story, I think it's a 1, and they put it there. And then the next person can actually keep going with new items, or they can change an old one. They could say the thing you just called a 1, I disagree, I think it's a 20. And then you just discuss those. Really fast and easy way to get to estimates. I'd maybe recommend it for a slightly more mature team, but a good way to go there. And this is basically the same idea as affinity clustering, where we're just grouping things into categories. Here I'm showing t-shirt sizes, but again, those categories could also be story points or any other unit. We're just saying, here are things and they're like these things are unlike them. And to get into some specifics briefly here before we run out of time, the Burndown. This is usually used for tracking a team's progress in a sprint. What I would just say is, if you just ask the team how they think they're proceeding day by day, then you may or may not even need to track things at task hours to get to something like this. You could just track it by the number of stories or backlog items you finished. We committed to 10, we're halfway through the sprint and have finished 6, looking good. Finished 2, looking bad. You get to the same point with less effort. So just consider that. Nothing wrong with using hours as an early stage thing, but sometimes may not be necessary. You can get away from it and make things simpler. Right? Because at the end of the day, it's just to say we're going to make it or not, and to correct and make a decision. Now to get to one very specific idea, one of my favorite long-term projection approaches is this, a release burnup. And I think if you combine this idea with things like affinity clustering, you can get to a very fast approach for estimating a number of items over the long term in a project. That is, take some high-level backlog items, drop them into t-shirt sizes, small, medium, large. In this little diagram, these red ones are large, the yellow ones are medium, and these blue ones are small. And you notice they're all, in fact, the same sizes. All the small ones are the same height, the large ones are the same height. So we're using that abstraction here to actually get some sense of how they play out relative to our capacity. And this is a way, again, to get a big picture notion of where we might be in the future. So a burn up here, we're looking at basically the worst case scenarios over a few sprints compared to the best case ones and getting a range. One of the big tips that I keep mentioning here is if you keep things stable, that range ought to get sharper and sharper over time as the team gets more consistent. If you're changing things a lot, it'll be wide all the time and therefore, again, not terribly useful. But what we're really trying to do here is speak in ranges. Say, right, we could end up here in the worst case, we could end up here in the best case. Let's talk about that, especially the worst case, and say, do we need to do something about it? So don't use these things just to project, but use them to make decisions and course correct over time. So just to sum some of this up, if we're looking at a situation where the cost of being wrong is very high and we have incredible information, well, you can use things like maybe function points, which again rely on lots and lots of data about systems, and frankly I've almost never seen it in an Agile area, but the one below it I see a lot, right? Using things like Monte Carlo simulations. Here are some of the best case numbers, worst case ones, run a bunch of variations on that in a spreadsheet and let's see what the range of possibilities is. That's great, right? It doesn't rely on wonderful information. You can have kind of sort of decent information and it can still give you a good number. And that is very similar to the stochastic model, right? Monte Carlo is a little bit more of an official simulation method that runs, maybe millions of possibilities. Stochastic, you're really just kind of taking best and worst and doing the cheap and dirty version of Monte Carlo. But it's the same idea, range of possibilities and see where it falls in. If you have terrible information, start with whatever story points you come up with, the right people, look back and see what happened and where it worked and where it didn't, and correct from there. So finally, just a few quick tips. Again, many of these I've mentioned, but I'll sum them up. Watch out for these biases. Finer numbers are better, wrong, right? Trying to basically let the most senior person always take something and estimate it, wrong, okay? You may not have the most senior person doing it all the time. Get a sense of how the group feels about it. Giving the number you think the project's going to take and then forcing the team to come up with the same number. Don't do it, right? I mean, a lot of these things we're lying to ourselves at the end of the day, and it's going to mislead stakeholders and make the team feel bad all at the same time. So not a good call. And of course, just because we've built something and then it's taken longer than we thought or less time, we shouldn't necessarily keep investing. We should understand we need to walk away. So if you want to make estimation better across the board, regardless of these units, here are some things. Try to eliminate handoffs between people, right? This having lots of different people doing different things and being unaware of one another's work can fuzzy it up. Likewise, things like delay and waste, of course. Multitasking is a big one. So the idea of context switching between one task and another can really muddy the waters and make it hard to understand. And finally, watch out for rushing too much. Right? Offer up one last thing. I mentioned the Basecamp methodology. They call it, it's instead of sprinting, they call it shape up is what they call it. And what they do is they offer bets. They say, instead of here's how long something's going to take, they say, here's how much we're willing to invest in it. Like we're willing to invest 2 weeks. They take 2 weeks and then they say, or should we do more or not? I think it's a smart approach. I think it's a good way to think about it. And maybe if you have people like product owners, have them approach it that way. Here's how much are we willing to invest in this? Team, what could I get for that? Beautiful approach. All right. So finally here, it's about understanding what are we trying to solve, making sure we got the right people at the table and looking at all the factors in play, trying to avoid changing things a lot in the system, changing the team, changing the project, doing 16 different projects all at the same time. All of that will make things problematic. Try to do vertical slicing. I didn't really speak to that very much, but that means don't just look at how long testing will take, let's say, but look at the end-to-end delivery. And if you have the right people, that'll naturally happen in general. Correct things over time in the size large components, like affinity clustering, small, medium, large. Count small ones, like story count within a sprint. Okay, you'll tend to find those work well because the small units average out. The large units aren't as many of them, so the averaging effect doesn't work as well, putting it very simply. I've got some references here, and I will go ahead and answer a couple of quick questions as we wrap it up. So Craig had asked you to hear an example of using Fibonacci hours in practice. How does this abstract number relate to real hours in planning? You don't tend to see people doing that. Just to answer this very briefly. Usually in planning, if you're using task hours, they're not using any sort of a system, a variable system like the Fibonacci series. They're just using 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, right? Just whatever the hours might be. You could do that is use Fibonacci series, but maybe I wouldn't recommend it. It's not necessary at that level. So Fibonacci tends to be more commonly applied to story points. And I saw Alan asking, how does t-shirt sizing tell us how much work we can do in a release? Well, we have to be able to relate those t-shirt sizes to some sort of delivery range. So usually there we'd be looking at the small things and basically saying, we think all those small things are somewhere between a day and 5 days. All the medium ones are somewhere between maybe 6 and 20 days, right? And then large is above that. So you're, in your other words, giving yourself maybe a range based on talking about a couple of them in a little more detail maybe. And then you can use that as a way to look back and say, that's what we might think we might be able to achieve. And this is what the small ones end up being. And Kelly asked if the recording will be shared after the session. Indeed, it will. So there's an easy way. The webinars are all up on our website for your review at your leisure. And finally, we've got a shock here. Can we avoid story pointing for work that is more support work and not sort of software delivery? Just estimate an hours at task level. Yep, absolutely. You could do that, or you can make it even simpler. If you're using something like Kanban, you can just do it, and it takes as long as it takes, and then you can look back and say, how long did it take? And look at a lot of other items that come up with a cycle time range estimate. That historically things like that in the system have taken between 3 and 5 days. And given whatever point it's at in the flow of development, we could offer people a, basically a service level agreement is what it's often called in Kanban, but an idea of how long it might take. Oh, you're at this point in the process, you're in, the testing queue, let's say. That means at this point your wait time is probably between 1 and 2 days, and we only know that because we've looked at hundreds of items flowing through the system, and that's how long they took on average, 90% of the time or so. So yeah, I mean, in many cases, things like the no estimates movement, that's kind of what they're saying to do. Build things, look back, say how long did things take to build, and just use those historical numbers rather than really estimating at all. We're probably just trying to break things into consistent, relatively small sizes and roll that way. All right. So I don't see any further questions, but again, I'll say, look into estimation a little more deeply. If you want a real deep dive, that book I mentioned right up front is a nice one. George Henry's Software Estimation Without Guessing. Software Estimation Planning, a classic by Mike Cohn, the first chairman of the Scrum Alliance, one of the guys, in fact, who really popularized methods like user stories and story points, although he didn't invent them. And if you want to look at maybe the Kanban style approaches, that Principles of Lean Product Development and Flow will give you some ideas there about thinking there. And finally, the last one is maybe the oldest school classic out there. It's been around for a long time. But looking at things like Monte Carlo simulations, getting the more statistical analysis techniques, right? And if you're ready to get a little deeper on it. So with that, I just want to say thank you all for joining. And let me look, actually, maybe a couple other questions we got here. 7 minutes to the hour. I'll try to roll in a couple more real quickly.
All right, and some people, Arlen, may be heading to their next meeting, so we do want to say thank you. If you have to drop now, we really appreciate your spending time with us today. If you have some harder questions, come over to our coaching circle. It's on Meetup. Search the DC Lean Plus Agile Meetup, and it actually starts in 7 minutes if you want to see us there. Or email in any questions. The recording will be available. One other thing, we had some questions about the slides. If you would like the slides, you can email any of our Lightspeed addresses, info@Lightspeed, and I will get you the slides. Maybe we can stick around for a couple more minutes for those last questions, but if you are someone that has to run, have a great day.
Thanks so much, Audrey. So I'll give it like 1 minute on these last couple, and then we'll close it off. Vinod asked, normally after giving very high requirements, the next question is when it would be done. How do you suggest to manage it? I would say that if you're looking at something that's going to take longer than people would like it to take, then give some sort of a target date and use that as an opportunity to basically discuss it. Discuss, do we need more time or do we not? Often it's not a bad idea to give yourself a target for something, to say, we don't know how long it'll take, let's give it a week, right? And in a week, we'll talk about it. Hopefully that was enough time to get it done, but if not, then we have the question of should we invest further or not? So get a general sense, put a date out there, and use that as a target to have a decision point to move farther or not move farther on it. Using story points and having task hours and anti-pattern Ashok? No, I don't think so. I regard it as kind of training wheels. To some degree, the task hours in particular. Story points are fine if you know how to use them. I think comparing them across teams is a problem, but I mean, many teams I worked with in the early days used it all the time and wasn't an issue. So I'd say when you begin to scale up and you look at environments where you have 15 teams working in concert, that's where things like story points are a little trickier because you're looking across teams instead of having it localized, and it confuses the situation. All right, and I think that was about it. So hopefully got you those last few details. And again, thank you everyone. We have a coaching circle coming up right here, so if anyone's got deeper questions, perhaps you could always join us there. And Bob will actually be leading that one, but I will try to join for a bit as soon as I get myself some lunch. So thank you all so much, and take care. I hope you have a wonderful day and a wonderful week. And again, if you have any deeper questions, feel free to send them along an email, and we'll try to address them as we get to them. Thanks so much.
And thank you for your time, Arlen. Thanks. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks. Take care.